Ken's up there at 50. Doing good.
50. Yeah. Love it. 21, 22. Oh gosh, gentlemen, we have a very mature audience here. The zero count? Yes, it does. You pick the best time to watch the webinar if you're at zero. Good. Well, I'll tell you one thing. Since we have such a senior crowd here, everybody's probably at the point in their life, in their career, that they've realized that there's more that they don't know than they actually do know. I know I didn't hit that till later in life. I'm a little bit slow on that front, but there's plenty out there. There's a lot of education. Today, the amount of information is just about limitless. All right, well, let's go ahead and get into this here.
Real quick, if I can, Dr. Castle.
I'm sorry?
Real quick, if I can.
Sure.
First of all, I have an 11-year-old. He knows everything. And second of all, I did have a request just a moment ago to do a recording. So I hit record. So everyone should know that this is being recorded.
Good. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chumley. All right. Today, our topic is going to be shaping organizational culture through intentional leadership. A lot of times people experience leadership and it's not really intentional. It's a way of life. So today, shaping organizational culture. Joining us is Dr. Thomas Chumley, Dr. Robert White, and myself, Dr. J.D. Castle. The three of us, we decided to get together and form a consulting organization because we have a commonality in the fact that we all have doctorate degrees in organizational leadership and a wealth of experience. Plus, these guys are good to get along with. So it works out pretty good. So let's start here. What is organizational culture? Let's all get on the same page so as we discuss things, we can have a point back and forth. I encourage everyone to go to the type box and type in a question if you have it. Type it in. If it's something real urgent, speak up and say, JD, I didn't understand that. Dr. White, if you would please say that one more time. We'll try to keep it informal. The point of us going through this is to share our information with you guys. So if you don't catch it, it really don't count. So please ask. What is organizational culture? The representation of beliefs, assumptions, values, norms shared by all members of the organization. Every group of people has a culture. It's usually driven by the strongest person in the crowd, the most powerful person, but one way or the other, there is a culture that is there. What's the health of your organizational culture, where you currently are right now? Ask yourself these questions. Do you have a culture of people that support other people, that you work as a team? Does your culture offer a place where people enjoy their work, or do they look at the clock counting down the minutes till 5 o'clock? Have you created a positive environment, the norm for increased productivity? Does everyone know their path, understand and support your vision, giving them a strong purpose? If I would ask people underneath you in the organization, what is her or his mission for the remainder of 2023, for Q4, or for next year, would they be able to share with me what your vision is so they know which way to go? That's very important. And does your culture inspire innovation? You guys have been around for 20 plus years, most of you, so you understand that the world we're in today is not like it was 20 years ago. It used to be much more localized. It's totally global now. You have more competition, you have more innovation. The world is just exploding. So your organization, as a leader, you have to be innovative. So let me touch on real quick about your leadership skills. Do you understand what is driving you? The why? Where does your passion come from? Do you know how to relate, motivate, and inspire other people? And do you have a clear vision of where you are going? These are the three primary principles, if you would call them the pillars of PhD Leadership Partners. We focus on these primary principles, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we get into those details, Dr. Chumley, if you would you go into a little bit and explain to us about what leadership is? How would you define leadership? Dr. Chumley?
Well, thank you, Dr. Castle. I really appreciate that, what you had to say. First of all, I want to help us to exercise our intellectual muscles a little bit. And there's some things I'm going to be getting into, and you do not feel any pressure at all to feel like you have to remember everything I'm going to tell you. But there is two things that I want you to remember. One is leadership can be defined. Two, leadership can be learned. Now, I first started getting into this whole leadership thing, and my wife, she's an engineer, and she sees things in black and white. And she said, well, what does leadership even mean? What is it? But before I get into that, let me talk a little bit about myself. There we go. So I started doing martial arts when I got into the military. I had a good friend of mine who basically introduced me to a group of guys who were Delta Force and Navy SEALs. So I got to do some hand-to-hand combat. This gentleman that you see in the picture there is Hoist Gracie from the first 4 UFCs, if you know what the Ultimate Fighting Championship is. So I got into martial arts a little bit, learned how to do that, and was an instructor. I even engaged in a amateur a cage fight, actually, and was offered to go pro as well. But I started out in the military, went on to, on the right-hand side here, you'll see 3 pictures. The first one there, that's South Carolina Emergency Management Division, where after I obtained my master's in public administration, I began working in the governor's office and then the University of Texas. So one of the things that lends some credibility to some of the things that you'll hear from me today is simply that the experience I've had professionally with leadership is not just dealing with people who are, I have direct authority over below within the organization, but also dealing with entities. Like when I worked in the South Carolina the governor's office, you're at the state level, and I had to deal with a lot of people in cities and counties and nonprofit organizations and organizations like the University of South Carolina and others, people that you can't control, that you don't really have authority over. And so how do you lead in situations when you have to pull, you have to attract rather than push, if you will? So this is what I meant by exercise the intellectual muscles. This is getting down to the core of what is leadership. So I'll run through this very briefly, but this is not all of it. This is just some. It's an interrelation whereby a conscientious being attempts, often through communication, to apply a capacity to affect another one or more in humans, usually towards some desired end state. Ideally, the desired end state is held in common, and often in the context of certain hierarchical structures and environments to include competitive. So the next slide is the definition summed up into 5 bullet points. So we've done the background, we've done the work on this. You don't have to know all of this, but what you do need to know is there's a lot of factors that affect organizational performance, but leadership is both a significant factor and giving advantage to those who harness it, and a factor that you can control. In a few moments, Dr. White is going to talk to us a little bit more about this, but I just want to hit on this point that what makes a leader great is one's behavior. So he will briefly talk about the development of leadership theory and how it went from the great man, here we have George Washington, to traits. And now the lion's share of what leadership research is about behavior. And that's the most important aspect of leadership. It works through a sort of psychosocial motivational process, which ends up having an effect on followers, which increases organizational performance. So as far as leader behavior echoing throughout the organization, I want you to imagine you're driving your car and someone cuts you off and it delays you 15, 20 minutes. When someone else tries to cut in on you, your feeling is less, let's say, benevolent, right? Or the opposite can be true, where someone lets you in, and so you're more likely statistically to allow someone else in. We can understand this type of behavior in driving. Well, it's even more true in organizations. The research tells us that the leader, particularly the higher the leader is up in that chain of command, if you will, the more effect that person's behavior has throughout the organization. So what I'm saying here is that leader behavior echoes throughout the organization. Now, as far as advances in medical science, so if we go back to George Washington, he knew before the leadership research came out that behavior was a critical aspect. How he knew that, I don't know, but he had this book and he wrote and was very concerned about his behavior. We know this. When he was in the process of dealing with, he first contracted pneumonia, they bled him. So an old way of dealing with certain ailments, the treatment for pneumonia, apparently for him, was to bleed him. Of course, we wouldn't do that today because we know it's not an effective treatment. Well, how do we know that? Well, this is commonly known. You don't have to be a medical professional necessarily to know that this isn't an effective treatment today. So advances in medical science is far more well known than leadership. The problem with leadership today is not that it hasn't developed, it has advanced, and leadership science is out there, and we know a lot actually about leadership. But the problem is that leadership is not known very well, even among people who lead organizations. So there's a body of knowledge that can improve performance of the organization at the organizational level, the team level, and the individual level. And that's what we need to know. Now is Dr. White, and I'm going to hand it over to him.
Thanks, Dr. Chumley. I really appreciate it. I really do like your overarching point that, number one, that leadership can be learned, and even more importantly, that there have been advances. So I do want to discuss that journey of leadership as an academic study, as a science. But I want to do it through the lens of my own personal journey. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself to start. So right out of high school, when I was 18, I enlisted in the U.S. Army Infantry, and I got to be an infantryman for a couple of years, and I got the great opportunity to go to West Point. After West Point, I was commissioned as a finance officer in 2001, in June of 2001. And we all know what happened just a few short months later on September 11th. So I was shortly destined to head to the Middle East, and I went to Kuwait and Iraq right in the beginning in 2003, and then back again as a commander in 2006 and 2007. So it was a great opportunity for me to start my leadership journey. At that point, I decided it was time for me to move on and do something else. I was able to leave the U.S. Army and join Motiva, which is a downstream refining, mostly company at the time. And then after that, I got the opportunity to come to Shell, where I've mostly worked upstream mega projects. And now I'm in my next phase of my journey as a co-founder of PhD Leadership Partners. I've always underpinned this by absolute devotion to academic scholarship. So when I did go to West Point, I got my undergraduate degree in chemistry and nuclear engineering. When I was in the Army, I was able to get my master's in finance from Webster's. When I left the Army and joined Shell, I was able to get my master's in project management from the University of Adelaide. And just recently, I got my ultimate degree as a PhD in leadership from Our Lady Lake University. Now, I would note that almost all of my degrees, except for my undergraduate degree, was while I was working. And so now I've got the great opportunity to give back to people that are in a similar situation where they're trying to continue their education as professionals, as an adjunct professor at Lone Star College. But to me, what underpins all this from the very beginning, from when I was just an 18-year-old infantryman and I met my wife, is I'm a family man. So I've been married to the same wonderful woman for over 2 decades, and we've got 5 fantastic kids you see there. But I want to relate that to the history of academic leadership. So it's not just about who I am, but also how does that relate to what I want to share with you today. So I go back to just after World War II in America, just after that devastating Great World War, and we're trying to figure out who could be the next great general, who can lead the armies and these huge armies in the future. And this is when World War II, and we had our first ever 5-star generals. So there you see a picture of a 5-star general, Douglas MacArthur. It's a statue at West Point. And when you look at the statue, it's striking, right? He's got his shoulders back, his uniform is neatly pressed, his feet are shoulder width apart. He's staring off to the distance as if he can see something none of us can see. And this echoed what at the time was what was called the great man theory. So a guy named Stockdale, a researcher, came along and read all articles he could find on leadership, 128 in fact, and said, okay, what are the traits? How do we find the next great leader? How do I point to a crowd and say, who's the next leader? Where is he from? What are his traits? What is his social background? He did it again in 1974, and what did he find? Well, he found that in general, traits don't mean that much. In general, social background doesn't mean that much. Leadership skills and relationships do matter. And this echoes my same journey as after I was commissioned from West Point and after I left the Douglas MacArthur statue behind. One of my very first battalion commanders was this woman named Colonel Marlene Fay, one of the best leaders I've ever dealt with. And she looked nothing like Douglas MacArthur. As a matter of fact, at the time, to me, she looked a bit like a grandmother, but she was one of the greatest leaders I've ever seen. So I learned from personal experience the same thing that Stockdale learned through research. So then as I was leaving the Army and coming to corporate America, I realized that most of the things that I'd learned that worked in the Army were not going to work the same in corporate America. I had no legal authority to tell anybody to do anything I wanted to do. And I would have a lot of informal type leaderships that are sideways or even up. And so I started to think about, well, how do I be successful in these different ways? And so I started researching different skills. I read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I looked at all these different books for all these what I would call Jedi mind tricks for how to almost trick somebody into doing what I wanted them to do. Similarly, around the same right after the Stockdale studies, you had the Ohio State and Michigan State studies that focused a lot more on behavior, a lot more on what a leader can do. You had the industrialization of the American industry, and you had concepts like lean thinking and Six Sigma and all this stuff that kind of went along with how does a leader get things done. And it kind of culminated at that point in research that started in the 70s through the 90s with the full range model of leadership with Bass and Avolio, where they basically talked about how a leader behaves across the spectrum from not so good to fantastic. But here's the problem, and I realized this pretty early in my professional career, is that a lot of those tricks were just that. They were tricks, right? And as Covey would say, I was focused on the personality ethic and not the character ethic. I was focused on making people like me for what I said and did, but not for who I was. So just like the tree that grows with no roots, that's what I was like. And I wanted to do more. And that's what led me to my journey to get the PhD is how do I do more? And real early, within the first year of my journey, I came across a book called Servant Leadership by Robert Greenleaf. And this one really resonated with me. And Robert Greenleaf says it begins first with the natural feelings that one wants to serve and serve first. Now, there are other fantastic leadership theories about the why of leadership, the intent of leadership. This one really resonated with me. I think back to my original picture, my service in the military. It all started there. And then coming to corporate America and figuring out how I could be a good servant of the people that I work with and that work for me. And then underpinned by my academic career culminating in serving people that just want to do life better. And then ultimately what all ties back to is how do I be a good servant leader to my family? And the good news is I was able to finish my dissertation in servant leadership, and I found what I kind of hoped to find, and what matched all the literature review, is that servant leadership is in fact correlated with job satisfaction. So what I did is I went out and surveyed hundreds of people, and I said, hey, do you feel like you work for a servant leader organization, and how's your job satisfaction? So each one of these dots represents how someone feels about their job and how they feel about the servant leadership. And so you can see in the bottom left, if someone had a low score, some of these light blue dots in the bottom left, that means that they didn't feel like they worked for a servant organization and they were unhappy. And in the top right, those that felt that they work for a servant organization were more happy. So now it gets to the part where I can directly apply this to you. And I love so much the fact that Hazel started out from the beginning saying that it's a leadership journey. And so I'm going to pause real fast because see Hazel raised her hand and I was about to mention you anyway. So Hazel, do you want to jump in and ask a question right here?
Yeah, I have a question about what the MSQ and SL are.
Yeah, thank you so much. The MSQ is the Minnesota Satisfaction Questionnaire. It's a standard instrument for measuring job satisfaction that goes back to the late 60s and early 70s. It's been used for decades for job satisfaction. So it's a standard survey that you can send out to people, and they'll return their job satisfaction. The SL stands for servant leadership. Similarly, it is an instrument by Van Dierendonck that tests people's sense of how much their organization is focused on servant leadership. Thank you for the question. So I want to bring it back and say, how can this apply to you today? How can you take this today? How can you take my research How can you take this data-driven concept to apply to what you want to do today? And so what you've got here is you've got all the dimensions according to Van Dierendock, according to that survey that I just mentioned, Hazel, of what are the dimensions of servant leadership. And by far and away, the one that I found that was most valuable is empowerment. And this is an interesting one because it comes back to the paradox of power, that the more power you give away, the more power you have. And so we can't really test somebody's intent, so we have to test their behaviors. And one of the greatest way we test their behaviors are, as a leader, are they willing to empower people to do things on their own, to make their own mistakes, to develop on their own? And that is one of the biggest drivers of job satisfaction. So if you could take one thing away from what I'm saying, if you could walk out of this meeting right now and change what's going on in your organization, empower the people that follow you, and they're going to be happier. I want to end my brief message here with these 4 paintings. Most of them are all by the same guy. You probably figured out based on the bottom right, Starry Night's a very recognizable picture by Vincent van Gogh. But there's one on here that's not by Vincent van Gogh, and that's the one in the top left. So you see what Vincent van Gogh did in his career is very similar to my leadership journey, right? First on the top left, he copied somebody. Then in the middle, you can see it's like a landscape. He wrote what he saw. And then at the bottom, he painted what he wanted to paint. And Vincent van Gogh said, normality is a paved road. It's comfortable to walk, but no flowers go. So although Tom made a very compelling case that there's a lot of science to leadership, there is a bit of art too. And in this case, painters start by copying others, just like I did back at West Point. Then they paint what they see, just like I did when I saw Colonel Fay and all those books I read. And then they paint themselves. I found my why, which is servant leadership. I want to help you find your why. Now I'll turn it back over to Dr. Castle.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. White. So many things to hit on. I hope people were taking good notes. I love the thing about Van Gogh, because I reflect the same kind of thing that resonates with me in my career. First, you see the people that are successful, so you copy them. Then you try to stretch your wings out a little bit more and then fly on your own a little bit. And eventually you get to the point where you know what you're doing. So how do we take the why? Once you get that and you understand it, how do you turn it into making it actually work? It all deals with dealing with people. Here's a little bit about me. I retired in 2017 and I started doing contract teaching as a professor across the United States. And COVID hit in 2000. It canceled all classes. So I got a little bit restless. So I took up the study of clocks. As you can see in my background, 1850 to 1910 is what I like to get into. It's horology, and I really enjoy that. I also like getting into gardening, plants outside. Love to get, not that I'm that good at it, but I enjoy watching things grow. I love sports cars, high performance automobiles. Similar to Dr. White, I'm a strong family man. Me and my wife have been married for, 45 years now. We have one daughter and a wonderful family. And then I enjoy working with the people, instructing, helping, and doing any kind of community event I can. These things together, what they do, they've given me the foundation of my perspective that I have on leadership for today. They give me the ability to take in all the different balancing dimensions to allow it to give a good, firm understanding of where we are. So interpersonal skills, this is the good part. These are the things that you need to wrap your arms around and take home. You have to have the ability to effectively communicate. Effectively communicate. Now, most people think when they say something or send an email, they've communicated. You have not. You sent an email is what you did. Communication is the transfer, and I'll get into that. You have to have the ability to influence other people. You have to maintain a positive attitude no matter what kind of turbulence the organization goes through, because you are the leader. You have to help resolve conflicts, and ultimately it might come down to you to make the decision. You have to have empathy for others. And I want to emphasize this because that's how you make the connection. You can't engage with other people unless you're connected. You can smile, you can do the outward things like Dr. White mentioned, but deep down inside, you've got to have that connection so people hear you and they understand what you're trying to say. You have to maintain high emotional intelligence. That's the big buzzwords over the last several years. Emotional intelligence, the ability to manage your emotions. We've all experienced the time where we talked too much when we should have shut up, and we said things we shouldn't have said. And about 30 minutes later, when your emotions calmed back down, you went, gosh, I wish I wouldn't have said that. You get to the point where you learn when you can feel those emotions boiling up, you just might have to walk away. It's better just to turn and walk away than it is to say certain things. So maintaining high emotional intelligence. And here's the key part: seeing others, their chair of perspective. You might think that you're absolutely right, and someone else might think the same thing. And you think, well, if I'm right, you must be wrong. Let's look at this picture right here. Some of you might have seen this before. In this picture here is an old lady, or is it a young lady? Type in the chat box if you would. Do you see the old lady or the young lady? They're both in the picture. Ah, good. I got a both, a young. What if I don't even see a lady? Both, young, both, and young. For those of you who are seeing the young lady, she's looking back into the screen. The older woman is looking downward to the left corner. They're both there. This represents a situation you might have an issue with at someone at work. They see the old lady and you're seeing the young lady, and you both are adamant with each other, trying to convince the other one that you're right, instead of listening to the other person's opinion and go, oh, I didn't see it that way. Communications. I want to define communication as the transferring of an idea, a concept, an emotion, or facts from one person to another. Effective communication is achieved when the recipient understands the source at the level of richness intended. When you say something, it doesn't mean you've communicated like I am here. If you are in the audience and you're reflecting on emails now, you're hearing the words, but you're not catching the essence of what I'm saying. If you catch the essence of it, that's true communication. That's what you need to do. Here is the key part in the communication arena. People do not effectively listen. If you want to do one thing that'll change your life and make you much more effective, learn how to listen effectively. It's very simple. When people are talking, when they finish, ask them a question. Don't try to grab the microphone out of their hand and tell your story. Listen to what they have to say. Ask them 2 or 3 questions. If they feel like they've been heard, then they'll want to listen to you. What percentage of communication are words? Only 10%. People strive to get this tremendous vocabulary. Communication isn't about the words that much, only 10%. Communication is 40% is tone. Let me say 2 things to you, and the same words in 2 different tones. Shut up. Shut up. Same exact words. When you communicate with people, do you think about the tone that you're using? Hazel, man, you're good. You're good. Thank you. If you think about the tone, most people do not. Body language is 50% of what you're doing. Body language is connected to your subconscious and it speaks the truth. For example, if I tell you something and I say, this is very important, what do you think? Have you ever spoke to someone and all of a sudden you turned and walked away and you looked at them and you said, they're up to something. I can't put my finger on it, but I know they're up to something. What happened to you was you were lied to. Their body language told you one thing and their words told you something different. Always rely on the body language. So these components right here are what makes up the foundation of communication. Let's take a different perspective on communication. A gentleman named Barlow, 1961. This guy's not famous, he's not highly recognized, but he had a very simple model that resonated with me that I could understand. I shifted my focus in my doctoral program at the last minute. And it was because as a vice president, I was getting inundated with emails continually, and they were only half to what they should have been. So this guy talks about the channel here, the channel of communication. Well, how do you choose to communicate to someone? Would you ever terminate somebody over a text message? No, some things require to be face to face. Some things you could slide down to video, some things maybe even a phone call. Let's think for a second. If I'm on a phone call, can you see my body language? 50% of your communication capability out the window, totally gone. What if you do an email? For goodness sakes, you can't even hear the tone. So now you're down to 10%. How impudent are emails? They're so bad that people come up with these smiley faces, these emoticons, and all these things, trying to crutch its way through to get the message across. If you want to be sure you get the message across, speak to someone and then follow it up with an email. Turning the why, now you get a good understanding of how to do it. It's called communicating and involving yourself with someone else and doing it effectively. And you know the why, the passion, why are you doing it? Now that you've got these tools, where are you going to? To elaborate on that, I want to call back Dr. White. Dr. White?
Thank you, Dr. Castle. Fantastic note. The point of body language and how much is lost through modern media is very critical. So much of leadership is in the little things, the how we look, how we smile, when we smile, the micro expressions. It's just important that we keep that in mind. But I do want to dig a little bit more into the where. So if you're at the point where you understand why you're taking on this incredible burden of leadership, and you've taken some of Dr. Castle's skills and applied them to the how, where are you going to take people? And Dr. Chumbley really started us off with a strong, very academic, detailed definition of leadership, which is very impressive. But Einstein said to truly understand something means to be able to explain it simply. And so to me, the way I simply explain leadership is just to move someone. That's it. But the question is, where do you move them to, right? How do you know that you're moving them at all? So if I go back to my Army roots and land navigation, the bottom line is, in order to get somewhere, you need 2 points. You need to know where you are and where you're going. And this is critical for any organization. And really what's going to happen is this is going to involve change. And this can be kind of a bad word in the projects community, but in general, we have to change in order to improve. And in general, people do think of change as a scary thing. And change, the best model for change is Kubler-Ross's grief cycle, which unfortunately I'm sure we've all experienced to some degree, whether it's losing a pet or losing a loved one. And that's tough. And so I think this is something we can all identify with, but even more importantly, it's something that's very applicable to organizational culture and organizational change. So as you're leading your company, as you're leading your people, as you're leading your team, or as you're cross-leading any through change, to understand that they're going through the grief cycle, the initial shock, the denial, then the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and then finally, hopefully, the acceptance point. And this is going to happen no matter what. But what's important is, as a leader, you can affect this cycle. You can affect it greatly. So if you look at this, the dotted line would be the unaffected, and the solid line is the affected. So over time and maturity, you can have incredible impact on the performance and morale, right? You can see that the denial doesn't get quite as bad because you've prepared people for the change. You've built that trust. You've communicated to them the long-term vision. The anger is not going to be as deep of a hole. The depression, the bargaining, it's not going to be as bad. And more importantly, you can get to a higher level of performance and morale at the end. And the true golden nugget is to get to the point of gratitude. Because the real trick is that the more you take people through a successfully leader-affected change cycle, the more you can get them, the more easily you can make it happen in the future. I just want to talk about one thing. I started to say that people fear change. It's not exactly true. To be honest, people fear loss. If I told you today that you just won the lottery and tomorrow you'll be a multimillionaire, I don't think you'd be afraid of the change. But if I told you tomorrow that you're going to lose millions of dollars, you'd be afraid of the loss. People fear loss. And to understand, just as Dr. Castle put it, that picture of the young woman or the old lady, what do you see? Shift your paradigm here. The exact same thing. Shift your paradigm and say, how do I take people to a place of gratitude and not talk about what they're going to lose, but talk about what they're going to gain? One more fundamental concept of what we do at PhD Leaders, I want to come back to the fact that leadership is a science. All of us have data-driven, have earned our doctorates based on data-driven dissertations, and that's what we love. That's what we do. Everything I see a chance to say, how can I put that vague concept into mathematical terms and help people drive behavior. And so we also focus on a concept called the balanced scorecard. And the balanced scorecard is a common concept, but just to explain it real fast, is if you're running a business, you have to think about all the aspects of how you run that business. You have to deliver on the financial results. You have to think about the customer. You have to think about internal business, and you have to think about learning and growth. And so they are all underpinned by the vision and strategy. So a real quick case study here, you can see this is HEB, one of my favorite grocery stores here in Texas, for those who aren't in Texas. And what you can see is you see people waiting in line, but there are cashier stations that are closed. 7 and 10 through 13 are closed, right? So what could you do as a leader, right? Of course, as a leader, you could open up more cashiers, but that's going to cost you financially, right? Also, you've got your point of sale or anything like that that could change stuff, right? That could change the customer experience, but you may need it to improve your internal business processes. And then finally, you may need to pull cashiers off the line to take them through that change cycle that we just talked about. So using a balanced scorecard is a way to make sure that your business is balancing a lot of them. Right? So one of the things we can do as a team is we can come in and we can talk to you about how to build some kind of balanced scorecard like this. This one itself is mostly focused on the financials, but we take a balanced scorecard approach underpinned by leadership, underpinned by some of these concepts we talk about: the intent, your skills, what kind of leader you are, what kind of organization you get, what kind of change you need to go through. And we help to create analytics because that's our base, that's our fundamental, is that this is a science that can be quantified to help you with the art of leadership. So I want to pause there. I do see a bit of energy about the balanced scorecard in there. So I think, Ken, you said you use the balanced scorecard. I welcome you to, up to you, if you want to share how you use the balanced scorecard. So I see in the chat, he's talking about HR analytics, which is fantastic, right? I mean, that's a fantastic step, Ken. So the 50-year leader in the room is right there, endorsing the overall strategy. It's fantastic. So if you see the graphic, we've talked about the where, we've talked about the how, we've talked about the why. Combining those three together is what leads us to leadership excellence. That's what we want to help navigate to leadership excellence. So I think at this point, we just want to open up the floor to any questions in general. Or comments, of course.
Yeah, click your mic if you can talk, if your mic's working well, or just type in.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm a corporate trainer, and I think so from what I'm getting is most of your work is in consultancy, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
So how do you affect, as an organization, you come in, you see the work that's to be done, and you leave a more nuanced brief, or you leave a more nuanced report on the changes, report on what needs to be done. How do you manage the long-term changes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hazel. So it's a fantastic question, right? So in general, we're a big fan of quasi-experimental concepts, right? We can't do experiments because you verge on the unethical piece and there's some limitations, but the quasi-experimental we can do is we could come in and give an organizational survey and say, pick whatever resonates with the leader of your organization. Let's say the leader says, I really want to be a transformational leader. He read a book, he or she read a book on that, like transformational leadership's right for us. Great. And then we can go out and we can test with the organization different aspects of transformational leadership. So there's 4 sub aspects of transformational leadership. And maybe we find in 2 of them, for whatever reason, the leader's strong, but in 2 of them, he or she is weak, or maybe the entire management team. Then we can set a targeted training program to say, hey, how do we over time improve the language and the behaviors for transformational leadership? If that's the target, if that's what we agree is the target. And then what we would do is we'd roll out this training program get some people focused, get some stuff together, do some interviews, that kind of thing to help make sure that we've got a fit for purpose training program. And then the most important part for a quasi experimental program is afterward to retest the same survey and to see the results, right? Because I think that that's a big part of it is we have to be able to quantify those results. That's why it gets back to those data-driven KPIs. And I think that that's something where, you know, then you can, as a company, we can decide together as a partner, we can decide together where to go from there. So let's say we see a huge increase in the scores and we're good and that's great, let's move on. I think we would still say, yeah, it's good. Maybe, you know, let's take down the hypercare to a refresher course in 3 to 6 months and then do another survey, right? And the important part is we have to link it to something non-transformational, right? So just like my servant leadership was linked to job satisfaction, we can't just say, are people transformational? We have to test in each organization, is the transformational tied to whatever it is you want? So there's surveys on like intent to turnover and things like that. And so we can create these correlation tables for you and your organization to say, here's what the data is telling us. Here's how we can train and help improve. Does that answer your question, Hazel?
Yeah, absolutely it does. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, from a trainer perspective as well, we do training. The key fundamental belief that a lot of people don't take the time to focus on, training only has value if it changes people's behavior. It's not enough just to have a great training program. If 6 months later, nothing is shifted, 3 months later, nothing is shifted, the training program didn't hit the target. It's essential that it changes behavior.
Yeah, I'm a very recently, freshly minted RN because I want to enter the healthcare field. And we were taught that in terms of evaluation and patient teaching, constantly evaluating the outcomes of everything that you're doing to see if it even has changes with the patient. And I agree with that. So I see that in my own head. I'm learning from this. Thank you.
You're welcome. Gosh, Ken, I sure wish your mic was working, man. You got a lot of good things to say here. I like what you said back in the, what was it? Tom was trying to steal that for our slogan, execute excellence every day. That's a good focus, man. That's an excellent focus. All right, any other questions? We've got a group of folks here, a lot more people attending. Somebody else speak up if you have any question at all. If you have a current situation you're struggling with. I mean, gosh, we got people in the room. We might not be able to answer. Maybe someone else in the room could. Anybody else want to share something? Please speak up or type in. Yeah, I hear you. All right, well, let's move on along. If something pops up, please chat in. As in closing here, I want to give you a couple of questions, a couple of perspectives to analyze your own situation. Here's a quick assessment. Do your employees want to follow you? As Dr. Chumley said, it's a pull rather than a push. Do you have negativity impacting productivity? Make no mistake, negativity is worse than coronavirus. Negativity can get in your organization and tear it apart. Have you created highly effective teams within your organization to maximize profitability? Not only having teams, but there's a term, highly effective teams. If you haven't caught into that, grab a hold of it, and that's something that we clearly can help you with. But in any event, try to focus on that. Dr. White mentioned on assessments and doing it before and post. This right here are some examples. And in this diagram right here, on the left and right, you have how deep do you want to drive and how wide do you go. The top is the route and the bottom is the destination. And you can see in each one of these slides, the participant in the survey excels in one area, but kind of weak in the other, not a balanced leader. For the top left, that person right there burned people on the way to success. You know, no matter what happens, we're going to be successful. On the right, they care for people on the road to nowhere because they don't have the vision where they're going. The bottom left, boss of many, but the leader of few. Nobody wants to follow them, but they have to because they're the boss. And the last one, major impact on a few people. You forget about the majority of your team, but you feel good because you're making success with only a few. We can go through those analytics, get the data, bring it to the surface, and understand and paint your target. Tom, Robert, and I are experts in the field of leadership. Based on decades of experience, our leadership abilities, and achieving the upper limits of academic excellence, we got together and formed a company, PhD Leadership Partners, trying to bring a better understanding of leadership to the market. Let us help you navigate your journey to leadership excellence. Here's our contact information. What we're willing to offer right here, if you contact us, we'll give you a complimentary assessment on yourself, or maybe it's someone working for you that you are interested in helping. Anyone along these lines here. So if you want to take a screenshot of that or write the number down, we can contact us on any one of those channels. Yes, Omar.
Hey guys, thank
Hey.
you for the invitation, and it's great to see Robert again. I had a hey, I had a question about the empowerment portion, because I think that's a great principle, but I think there's a lot of tension there with empowerment and then also kind of letting people fail, and how much. I'm curious, just maybe hear some examples of how do you balance the allowing people to kind of take on some things that maybe there is going to be failure, but then also kind of dealing with the repercussions of, hey, there could be some things that are incorrect or things that are not done properly. So just maybe some pointers or anything to speak on that.
Omar, you nailed it. That is exactly the problem that a lot of young leaders face. A lot of young leaders who are just technical experts who did so well in their field. And then because they did so well, that's how they got promoted. And now they're a leader and they know the right way to do things, and they don't want the people that work for them to fail. It's not just because they don't want the people to look for them to look bad. They want things to go well. And all I can say to that is I look at my own experience and I think about all the failures I've had over my life, thankfully to leaders that have empowered me to let me fail. And I've recovered from all of them. They've always made me better, right? So I would say that at the very least litmus test we all can do as leaders is to say, think about our failures and how we were still able to recover from them and get them better. And why on earth would we deprive the people to work from us for that same great benefit? Now, having said that, a lot of it depends on the maturity of the individual and where they want to go. This comes back to transformational leadership and individual consideration. Somebody young, right out of college, we want to empower them, but we want to build in safety nets, right? And so maybe that safety net is, you make sure that you review whatever they're going to do a couple of days before they do it. They're allowed to build it. They're allowed to do everything, empower them as much as they can, but just don't let them fail. Or maybe you kind of prep the other leaders in the room to say, hey, this new college graduate's going to try something. Let's give them some space. So I say that as a leader, we can lay the groundwork and the safety net to let them fail, but to deprive them of that opportunity to even hit the safety net, that's probably the problem, Omar. So all I can say is, just like anything as a leader, is look at your own experience, look at your own failures, assess how bad a failure can be for an individual, and put a safety net in place to make sure that they learn, but they don't end their career over it. So not a great answer, Omar, but the same answer we give on everything is it depends.
No,
but my only reference point is, how did you fail?
Yeah, spot on, Dr. White. I tell you what, one of the biggest shortcomings of leaders today is the lack of delegation. And it's because of that fear of failure. And if you think about it, the only way you learn anything effectively is to fall on your face. Then you won't make that mistake again. But the safety net is essential. Very well said. I'd like to take another perspective on that for you, Omar. One of the big things that leaders have to do is balance multiple things as you deal with it. That's a perfect example of balancing the short term versus the long term. In the short term, you don't want any mistakes to happen. It has to work perfectly. So today was a perfect day. In the long term, you're willing to do whatever it takes to make that person get to the goal line and be a superstar. That's what you're trying to do, is grow your team to be superstars. You can't have both. You have to get that balance in the middle. And that's where the art perspective of it comes into play, and it'll improve with experience.
Also, if I can add a little bit for you, Omar, there's some academics, Hershey and Blanchard, and they came up with a grid. And on that grid, it talks about basically follower competence and follower commitment. Now, you have to, of course, individualize this for each person. But if you put that person on a grid of how competent is it high and how much commitment they have, that they might have high competence and low commitment, or high commitment and low competence. And it's always, the decision is always going to be on you as a leader. But if you have that grid and you think of that as well as, as Dr. White mentioned about your own experiences being in that and failure, that might be a useful tool for you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Omar, for the question. We feel good now.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you as well, Hazel. Anyone else? Let's have one more and we'll wrap this up. Someone else.
I think that might be a new hand from Hazel. Hazel, is that a new question you've got?
Oh, someone else can go ahead of me if someone's there. That's fine.
No, there's no more hands. Omar's hand's still up, but I think we addressed that. If not, speak up again, Omar, if you got another one. Otherwise, Hazel, feel free. Go ahead.
I wanted to caveat off of your issue with delegation. I work in a field where delegation is very legally defined. What tips would you give to those leaders who don't have delegation that's specifically defined?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm trying to read into what you're saying, right? So when I think of what you're saying, I've got a similar thing where there's specific legal delegations in corporations where it's like an individual can't sign a PO for more than $10,000 without their boss or something like that. So there are legal specific things on manuals of authorities and manuals of delegation. And all I can say is that the legal framework is important, and we don't ever want to advise against breaking anything, any kind of like moral, ethical, or legal laws. What I can say is that even in those situations, there are ways to empower people on the how they do things. There are ways to empower people on the how they discuss things, right? So for example, let's say I don't have the legal authority to sign $1 million purchase order. What I could do is my boss could empower me to say, hey, I still want you to have engagement. I still want you to put together your analysis. I still want you to put together the decision quality analysis on why we should do A, B, or C. And then bring that back to me and a couple of my leader peers, and we'll have a discussion. So that'd be my only advice, Hazel, is that in my past, although I haven't had the legal authority to do stuff, my boss has brought me in, and I've done the same thing with people that report to me. I've brought them into my peers to say, let's talk about this at a leadership senior level. Let me bring you and have a seat at the table. And that has an equally, not an equal, but an also empowering effect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel.
All right. Thank you, Dr. White. Anyone else? We're down to 4 minutes to the hour.
Shannon
We had a
Crosby.
question from Shannon.
Yep.
Oh, Shannon.
Hey, Robert. Good to see you.
Shannon, good to see you.
Loving everything that you guys covered. I'm curious, as leaders yourself, who was y'all's biggest mentor and leader you've come across in your journey? And what was their biggest quality about them?
Wow. Let me step in real quick. From my standpoint, I had 2 mentors in my career. I had one in the year 1983 who opened my eyes to an entire other world of how business operated. And I had a second one in the year 2000. And at that time, the same thing. They took me up to the next tier in how business and leadership all evolved and work together. It's individuals that are willing to work with you. But on your side, you have to be willing to let them know that you're willing to be the protege. You know, when I joined this clock club here, I got into it about a year ago, and I went up to the first session. And after I met the gentleman there, I found one guy who had been doing it for 57 years. So I asked him, I said, I want you to be my mentor. Would you mind? And it took off from there. Dr. Chumley, do you have something?
Well, just I remember as a kid, there's a guy to this day I remember his name's Mike Steven, and just the fact that he took the time to be a mentor to me, and I just recall him being so wise. I mean, I was still a kid. It was immensely impactful in my life that he took time out and was like a mentor, almost like a second father in some ways. So I hope that's addressing your question. But
Yeah.
that was so impactful to me. And it gets back to what Dr. White was saying about being a servant leader. I mean, that heart to be able to do that.
And Dr. White, we saved the best for last.
I don't know about the best, but deep down, Shannon, I'm still that little scared infantryman at 18 that showed up at basic training the first day, and Drill Sergeant Lichtenwaller, who couldn't have been 5'6", only came up to my chest height, and he just scared the dickens out of me. And typical, just if you would picture a movie drill sergeant, that's what this guy was like. Cussing, spitting, swearing, smoking us all. But what I'll never forget is through all that, at the very end, I got insight into the why. I got insight into the fact that he truly cared about his country. He truly cared about all of us as individuals and didn't want to send us in harm's way unless we were ready. And that still affects me to this day.
I love that. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. All right, everyone, last call. We got a last call here. Like at an auction I used to go to, it's all in, all done. Going once. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this. Thank you for your time. We hope to hear from you soon. Signing off, Dr. J.D. Castle.
Tom, Dr. Chumley.
And Dr. R. White, thank you all so very much for your time today.
Bye-bye.